small group, I can be less rigid. And although you're here to learn about connectivity, which I think we will get to, I just wanted to address that really in the context of what has been going on in the world in the past month. Because it would be what I would call an anti-connectivity force.
Absolutely.
That is happening. So I think we have to identify the force, understand how to address it, and then we can talk about the high-speed railways and the internet links and the Russia to Mongolia and beyond thing, which is one of the most exciting things. But this is my take on it, and I hope that some of you at least completely disagree with me.
Then we can discuss.
Over the past quarter of a century, since the Berlin Wall came down, Western democratic capitalism has flourished, it's been tested, and now it is found severely wanting. Its global credibility abroad has already been shredded from the Iraq invasion, which didn't work, the Arab Spring, which kept that sort of democratic export momentum going and ended in bloodshed, and numerous other exported blueprints, I call them, like South Sudan, the world's newest country, which had the finest brains in the world putting together something, and as soon as it was implemented, war broke out. In my view, and in small groups I get very angry about that, because those people should no longer have the jobs that they're doing, but they've probably gone on to do Burma and other places like that. But now it's become even more serious for us because there's a rebellion in the West. And that's been caused by the damaged economies, the growing disparity of the wealth, and a political class that's perceived to be out of touch, privileged, and ineffective. Now, Britain's decision to leave the European Union and the success of Donald Trump are two leading examples of this rebellion. And there's no coincidence that they're happening simultaneously. This is our Western democratic society. So let me just encapsulate that the concept of Western democratic system is an accountable government brought to power through elections, funded by revenue from the capital markets, which distribute wealth fairly, thus creating a stable society. After the Berlin Wall came down and the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a widely held assumption that with all the rival systems out of the way, that this would be the beacon to which the world would strive and we would all eventually live under it. That's no longer the case, and it's become less the case in the past 6 months or so, because too many are living fruitful lives under Chinese-led authoritarianism, while discontent in the West has created this critical mass of voters who believe that the system is rigged against them. Now, one of the key pillars of democracy, or the key pillar of democracy, is the partnership between government and citizen, in that together they will choose a way forward. But it's so badly frayed now that voters are opting for high-risk change. They no longer believe that reform can come from those currently controlling the levers of power. In one way, this situation is not comparable to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but in another way there are too many similarities for us to completely ignore it. So when I say, see what happened to Russia, Soviet Union, and people say, don't be so stupid, well, let's talk about what people were saying about Donald Trump 6 months ago. Now, democracy itself isn't at fault, because actually it's not a bad system, but we're operating it through outdated mechanisms. And they've been proved to be unfit for the modern age. So rather than feeling involved through their elected representatives, people have a sense of being excluded, left behind, and that's not how democracy is meant to work. So this is happening simultaneously both in Britain and in the United States. The majority of the Republican members of Congress have been opposed to Donald Trump. Yet he saw off 14 rivals to win the Republican nomination. Here, 2/3 of the elected members of Parliament chose to stay in the European Union. Yet 52% of the voters wanted to leave. And that became what's known as Brexit. So this gap between politician and voter reflects a growing mistrust in government from the grassroots. In the United States, the Pew Research Center, 19% of Americans trust their government now. In the 1960s, that figure was 70%. In Britain, the statistics I've stripped out of that, here it's on a wealth disparity. So if you earn more than £100,000 a year, 50% of those people trust the government. Well, why not? Life's pretty good.
Yeah.
But if you're in that £20,000 a year bracket, then 75% have little or no trust in the government. And if you look at the Brexit indicators, that those who voted Brexit, they are mostly from that economic grouping. So this trust deficit has produced a new style of politics. And this is where the connectivity element falls into danger, where the economy and living standards take a second place to what people see as a restoration of their dignity. So if material gain needs to be forfeited in order to get our sovereignty back or control our borders or whatever it is, then so be it. So Trump says he wants to take back America. And here, warnings from experts about job losses, fall of living standards, counted for little against the cry that we were regaining our independence. So Michael Gove said, people have had enough of experts. That was a really salient comment in our present time, because we have some side effects that come in from that. You know, if people aren't concerned with facts, figures, what are they actually concerned with? And what has happened in this is this, I don't know, both Trump and Brexit have been popularised on a stream of misinformation, essentially, that we all know about. So Trump's claim that Muslims publicly celebrated the 9/11 attacks, which has been, and he's on the fact checkers in the States, which are much better than us, every day proved to be wrong. And the Democrats, strangely, when I look this up, you have Trump, who was at Cheney, Ben Carson and Ted Cruz were right at the red of misinformation. And the Democrats, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were at the sort of truth-telling end of the chart. But if truth mattered, then Hillary will be way ahead of Donald Trump.
Exactly.
But she's not. She's just sort of slightly ahead. She'll peak a bit during this convention. And then here, within hours of winning the vote, the Brexit campaign were already backtracking on how much money would go to the NHS and how many immigrants would be prevented from coming here. But it didn't dent their platform at all, because the lead campaigner, Boris Johnson, has a record of lying about his mistresses and about Europe, and everybody's talked about this. He's been rewarded with the job of Foreign Secretary. And he remains one of Britain's most popular politicians.
Excellent man.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Excellent man, quite possibly. But this is what, there was a wonderful letter to David Cameron from the outgoing Canadian High Commissioner, a man called Jeremy Kinsman, who said, in the post-factual political age, reasoning doesn't reach the heart. I thought, and to win, you need to mobilise a convincing passion. But they have found, and I'm putting Trump and the Brexiteers in the same camp, they found that passion isn't just the only thing that's needed here. You also need hostile aggression. Because both the Brexit campaign and the Trump's campaign gained their popularity on fear. I know the Brexiteers said it was the other way around. I'm glad that
The Remainers is Project Fear. Project Fear was Cameron.
Well, we can discuss that in a minute, but I can tell you that when you have a stream of immigrants against a white politician coming into the thing, that's Project Fear. But let me go into that a little bit more. Boris Johnson compared the EU to Hitler's Germany. Yeah, it's not true. We all know it's not true. But that's what he did. And he, in his quest to create an undemocratic superstate. And then the picture that was painted of Britain was impoverished, angry, controlled by foreign powers, and being swamped by migrants. But the truth is that Britain had the lowest unemployment ever, And during the campaign, I'm not sure about now, it was set to become Europe's best performing economy. So that message was completely reversed. And the Project Fear element, I always thought should have been on the other side. It was something that was taken from that. Now, Trump describes America as a broken nation, and that prompted Barack Obama to say, I rather like this, we're not going to make good decisions based on fears that are not based on facts.
That's right.
I thought that was a good, and we were going to miss Obama when and here we get down to the nub of it. If Western democracy is moving towards this fear-driven politics, the dangers are really acute, because the key characteristic of this politics is blame others for society's ills. So sometimes the target's an ethnic or religious community. Sometimes a concept such as globalisation is blamed, and it's now being condemned, which is being condemned by many, and sometimes it's an unpopular overarching authority, like the European Union. And we've seen what happens in these cases recently, in most of our lifetimes. When that authority is unglued, the former Yugoslavia disintegrated into civil war, when the Soviet influence vanished. Iraq followed a similar path with the ouster of Saddam Hussein. And what we were talking about just before we came here, it's notable that in Britain we're dealing now with an upsurge of ethnic hate crimes. Now, I've talked to people from Brexit about this, and they say, well, it's nothing to do with us. But actually it is. But we don't quite know how, but there has been an upsurge of hate crime. And Scotland now says that it's going to have another referendum to disintegrate the European Union. So what you're getting is a direct Project Fear reversed element here. Now, I think the Western democratic institutions there will be strong enough to withstand the worst of these pressures, but the question still needs to be asked as to what will Trump do, who will he focus on, if he defeats his main enemy now, which is Hillary Clinton. Because she's the predominant cause of the unity that he had at that conference. And what will the British, angry British, do once the European Union can't be blamed for all their ills? Where will that anger go? Now, Theresa May, in her first speech, understood this. And this is where we begin. And she says, we will pass new laws, we will listen not to the mighty but to you. We will make Britain a country that works not for the privileged few but for every one of us. But what worries me on this is that for the penny to drop, it's taken the imminent disintegration of the world's biggest trading bloc and the placing of a once bankrupt television celebrity real estate mogul within a hair's breadth of the White House. I'm not sure we've got time to wake up for it. So to get back to my point and to bring the pillars of democratic capitalism need to be repaired. We need to make sure that the elected representative represents the view of the people and that those people have a view that can move us forward. And right now, it's not the only show in town, because throughout Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, you've got another system, which is wealth creating, infrastructure building, high achieving, hard driving, one-party snake that's snapping at our heels. And we have no mechanism to do that. So what is happening with the system of voting on the democratic system at the moment is that this idea that I would have said even 6 months ago, that we've seen in East Asia, whereby war and hostility is flooded out by trade and connectivity and wealth creation and that wealth dripping down. And that, for some reason, is not enough at the moment. People want something else. And I was at a conference in Seoul, at one of your conferences, Robin, a year or so ago, where East Asia was looking towards the European Union as a model to give them that something else. But they can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And we've all read about the South China Sea issue, these rocks and everything like that. The narrative of East Asia used to be about high-speed railways and trade deals and skyscrapers and ports and airports and all that sort of thing. The media narrative now is about warships and disputed territory and arms race. And that's not a healthy place to be.
Correct.
And then inside of all this we have China. China is a rival system to our system. It might end up being like our system, it might end up being a fine system, and a lot of people are finding it a very good system to live under, particularly if you're an Indian villager against a Chinese villager. You'll prefer to be that Chinese villager because you can put down a mortgage on a high-rise apartment, whereas in India you can barely get to school and your sandals, that sort of thing. But what, in my view, is happening here is two things. One is that you've got these incredible elements going on that China is doing. For instance, I wasn't aware, I don't know if anybody's, that China has used more cement between 2010 and 2013 than America did in the whole of the 20th century. What on earth is it building? America wants to get 2 million jobs back from China to the US. China is sending 100 million jobs outside of China into Myanmar, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, all of the other lower wage places than itself, because it's moved up into this sort of area. China is seen from the US Congress's point of view as a one-party communist state that locks up prisoners and blind activists and all that sort of stuff. But it's not being seen from the other viewpoint, that China simply wants to protect its supply chains for the next century. And that is what is driving it. It doesn't have like us a sort of idea of conquering territory for trade. It just wants to secure its supply chains from Latin America, from Africa and all that, and that's essentially what the South China Sea is all about. It doesn't want to be told at some stage that because it's locked up the wrong prisoner, its supply chains are going to be stopped there. And I have had conversations in the past week. People in Washington, I had lunch today with the Indian High Commissioner and politicians here, and the question I put to them is 100 years from now, it is unlikely that the United States will be the predominant power in the Asia Pacific. I don't even mention Europe. Who is thinking about how to manage that change? The answer that I can convincingly tell you there is that nobody is. And therefore you have a situation where we know what is happening now, like I was talking to Keith about between the First and Second World War. We would know what is happening with China at the moment. And we know it is going to continue to expand. It doesn't have an electoral cycle that it has to satisfy. It has been doing what it's doing for the past 20 or 30 years. When I was in Beijing, it was putting up bamboo fishermen shelters on these islands. They didn't then have the wealth or the wherewithal to go further. But our Western democracy system hasn't actually sat down and seen how it will work. And therefore, at some stage, you will have conflict unless that happens. So what essentially we're looking at when we talk about connectivity, trade and all that is that in the past year I think that balance has slightly been disrupted in all our minds. We've seen that it can be disrupted. So when we say no, it can't possibly happen because China controls the whole of the Wi-Fi thing and Boeing have got a factory there and they've just signed a deal with Mercedes to do this and do that and everything else, that at some stage that might not matter. And Congress will put through something to say that all of that has got to be unwound. Walmart. Now, a year ago, I would have said that's a crazy thought. But if we're now beginning to unwind 43 years worth of laws that we've had with the European Union, probably to the economic the economic downturn of the United Kingdom, then that can happen. And it can happen quite easily. I think what we've got to think about throughout all this is that the dynamic between military escalation and economic escalation. And keep watching that over the next year or 2 years to see how that pans out. I'm going over to Washington to discuss this next week, and then I'm going to India and China. And should we meet again, I hope to have a clearer idea. But at the moment, I'm at a complete loss. I like to have conclusions. But with what's been happening, you know, I'm at a complete loss as to how this is going to pan out. I always thought that if you could wake up, if you're in Liberia or Cambodia and you wake up and you see a new school and a new hospital and a new highway or your internet connection, you'll just keep going towards that beacon that gives you that. And we saw that in Poland and Hungary after the end of the Cold War. But now look what's happening in Viktor Orban in Hungary and what's happening in Poland that are saying, no, we don't accept what the EU is doing, we don't want it. So I absolutely don't know where the world is going to be in the next year from now. Thank you.